Mr. Babson will say multinational finance institutions, the same thing, basically, and how multilateral lending institutions, what it means is like World Bank, ADB, Latin America Bank, Africa Bank, and I guess recently Infrastructure Investment Bank, China's, right? As those are, and then how multilateral lending institutions and private capital can be utilized. But key is the North Korea is under the sanctions. And yesterday there was a session on UN sanctions on North Korea, and I learned that the first sanction was imposed 2006 after the first nuclear bomb test by North Korea. And the last one was imposed December 2017 after the sixth North Korean bomb test. So there were several sanctions, different sanctions imposed upon North Korea. And I learned that this sanction, so-called regime, is most comprehensive and extensive. So with the sanctions imposed, there are very few things that can be done, either by multilateral lending institutions or by private capital. But if we discuss what these international capital can do after the sanctions lifted, that would be very, very much hypothetical discussion. So what we will focus today would be what can be done now, even before the sanctions are lifted, that can help North Korea to move to market economy and hopefully more economic prosperity. And to this topic, we have three experts. First would be Babson, Professor Babson, Bradley Babson. He is currently a professor, but he used to work for the World Bank. So he will provide a broad overview of the situation. And then second speaker would be Dr. Lee Young-seok. He works for Research Institute, Finance Research Institute in Korea, and he will talk about a more current situation on the peninsula, including Kaesong complex and Kumgangsan, and also what the South Korean government is trying to do to help North Korea. And third speaker would be Jeffrey See, to the far left. He works in Singapore, and he organizes and runs this NGO, international NGO called Joseon Exchange, and he will explain to you what he has been doing. A very interesting story. So we look forward to your case study of what can be done before the sanctions lifted. So I'll give each of you about 8 minutes to start, and then after that we'll have some discussions among ourselves, and then we'll open the floor, the discussion to the floor, because I'm sure this topic will attract many questions from the floor. Okay? Okay. So may I ask you, Brad Babson, to start? 8 minutes.
I will do this from here instead of the podium.
Oh, you changed your mind.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me just start by saying 21 years ago, I visited Pyongyang as the first and only ever World Bank mission to talk with North Korea about what it would mean to join the international financial institutions, and particularly the World Bank. And I've been working on North Korean economy ever since, so we kind of get stuck. And we can talk more about what it was like back then. But I've really given a lot of thought over the years to what role the World Bank and other international financial institutions could meaningfully play in working with North Korea, both on their internal economic development, management, and policies, and the way they manage their economic relations with foreign businesses and foreign governments and other institutions. So I would like to be provocative this morning because I would like to make an argument that the international financial institutions should be involved in North Korea now rather than later, before sanctions are lifted, not after sanctions are lifted. And the rationale for this argument is that these institutions, within their mandates, can make a positive contribution to the ongoing negotiations on the security and political issues. Even though they're not political organizations, they can help create an environment of confidence that economic issues can be handled in a meaningful way as a result of those negotiations. And they can also set the stage for realistic economic engagement if the negotiations are successful, because I don't believe that North Korea is ready for the inflow of money, even if the negotiations succeed. So the current thinking really is that with the focus on sanctions and maximum pressure, any meaningful engagement on economic benefits for North Korea should begin with exceptions to sanctions approved by the UN Security Council and no significant transfer of resources for other than humanitarian purposes until there is credible progress on the denuclearization agenda. And the underlying assumption is that if a deal is successfully negotiated, a large amount of investment will be made available to North Korea from multiple sources, both official and private. An important development in North Korea in the last few years is that North Korea is now giving highest priority to economic development and is pursuing their own economic development strategy and economic management, quote, in our own style, unquote. Yet no senior economic officials are directly involved in the political negotiations process, and to my knowledge, there's not been any Track 2 or 1.5 interaction with senior economic officials since a technical working group was established to help resolve the Bank Delta Asia issues that impounded North Korean funds in 2006 and disrupted the six-party talks for many months. At that time, an informal technical working group made up of senior North Korean officials met with senior Treasury officials in the United States and over a period of about 8 or 9 months worked out a resolution to the BDA problem. But I talked with the North Koreans because they invited me to invite them to dinner and talk about this before they met with Treasury in New York. And they really liked the chance to talk with American financial officials outside the political framework. And it was quite an interesting moment, but nothing like that has happened since. Economic security must be recognized to be an integral part of the overall national security equation for any country, but particularly right now for North Korea. And North Korea will need to believe that its economic future will not be compromised by the ways in which economic engagement will be advanced if concessions are made on the military security front in exchange for security guarantees and support for economic development. Also, North Korea will not want to be railroaded by future economic partners who will be seeking to advance their own interests in economic relations at the expense of North Korea's own interests. And the history of South Korean, Chinese, and Japanese economic policies towards North Korea is marked by a lack of coherence among these different countries and self-interest. North Korea will want to remain in the driver's seat, even while adopting reforms to improve economic performance and come into closer alignment with international norms and expectations. In this environment, the role of the multinational financial institutions could well be critical in helping North Korea to adjust its economic development policies and management to help them prepare for the expansion of economic relations following a successful negotiation process. Adjusting to removal of sanctions and moving towards a much more transparent and legally based system of external economic relations will be a major challenge. And the MFIs are well placed to provide a helpful role, as their mandate is to help countries succeed, not to fail in their economic development and management. And they provide politically neutral and unbiased advice and services. Advice, training, and technical assistance can help North Korea to build capacity and confidence in navigating these transitions and prepare national income and balance of payments statistics that will need to underpin an opening to the international community, both official and private. Apart from the adjustments and readiness for a different external and economic environment tied to the nuclear negotiations process, the dynamics of economic systems change already taking place within North Korea pose significant domestic challenges for which the MFIs can also be helpful. North Korea has evolved to be a mixed economy, with market-based activities now accounting for about a third of GDP. Despite the domestic implicit support for this expanding role of markets, formal North Korean policy statements and political rhetoric largely ignore the role of markets and implications for managing a mixed economy and with private actors, private accumulation of savings and investment decision-making, and illegal but allowed private trading rights for such assets such as housing. The financial system, legal system, and macroeconomic management are behind the curve of these developments. More importantly, the social contract in the relationship of the state to the people has been dramatically challenged by the growing role of markets. As self-reliance takes on a more personal character than a corporate societal one at the household level, the North Korean foundational values of reciprocal obligations of the leader and the people and personal interests being subordinated to those of the collective society are losing internal salience. Kim Jong-un, in his promises to the people not to have to tighten their belts again, has tethered his legitimacy as a leader to broadly based economic development, and he needs to recalibrate the social contract as the traditional economic system evolves to enable sustained economic growth and changing external economic relations. This is a formidable domestic challenge for Kim Jong-un, and one that early involvement of the MFIs could help him provide substantive advice and legitimacy to encourage him to enact the reforms needed to navigate these very difficult transitions. International concerns about North Korea's human rights conditions have until recently largely been ignored in the negotiations on the nuclear and other military security-related issues. However, given North Korea's push for economic development, these negotiations will need to address economic rewards in substantively meaningful ways that go beyond just the pace and timing of relaxing sanctions. This presents an opportunity to seek opportunities in future economic engagement policies and reforms in internal economic management practices that can produce a win for economic development and also a win for some human rights improvements. If handled adroitly, these measures could give Kim Jong-un acceptable ways to manage internal transformations in the relation of the state to the people in the economic sphere. Measures that result in positive human rights impacts, such as reduced use of forced labor and clarification of private asset ownership rights, could also help improve the environment of international support for the negotiation process. Early involvement of the MFIs could make a positive contribution to seeking such outcomes in a non-threatening way. In considering a potential role for the MFIs in North Korea sooner rather than later, it is worth noting that when Vietnam in the late 1980s made the strategic choice to pursue economic renovation under the Doi Moi policy and to open up to the international community, they reached out to the IMF and World Bank for mutual learning, advice, training, and technical assistance and pre-investment studies. This evolved positively over about a 4-year period before there were any loans given by these organizations. But a firm foundation had been laid for a successful transition, and the rest is history, and I don't need to go into that here. In looking ahead to a potentially successful nuclear negotiation process, an important issue will be coordination of future economic engagement by both multilateral and bilateral donors and private investors. As in the case of Vietnam in the early years, North Korea does not presently have the knowledge and capacity to manage this scale and composition of economic relations without internal and external confusion and complications. Helping the government prepare for an investor coordination role that is integrated with their own economic planning and policy making apparatus would benefit from neutral multilateral advice and technical assistance in advance, as both a confidence-building measure and a practical one to forestall more misunderstandings and minimize implementation challenges. North Korea is not currently a member of any of the MFIs, thus some may question the legal basis for an early MFI role. As a practical matter, in the case of other transition countries following the collapse of the former Soviet Union, technical assistance and advice was normally provided in advance of membership to assist in the process of meeting membership requirements. The MFIs also have multiple ways to provide services to non-members when it is in the interests of existing members to provide such services. While not legally required by the boards of such organizations, endorsement by the UN Security Council of the purposes and forms of MFI assistance would provide political support and conformity with sanctions or the need for granting of exemptions to sanctions. In conclusion, a successful negotiation on military security issues will need effectively to address the complicated questions of North Korea's readiness to absorb foreign capital in the ways international donors and investors will expect, and to manage the different interests at stake in future external economic relations. These imperatives, coupled with the domestic challenges facing North Korean leaders and policy makers in making changes in the economic system that have been evolving with a growing role for markets and returns to private initiative, will require adroit management and perceived legitimacy both at home and abroad. It is hard to imagine, for me, how North Korea and the international community could address effectively these critical challenges without enlisting early the support and involvement of the MFIs.
Thank you, Professor Babson. I forgot to introduce him properly. He is currently professor at Baldwin College. That's in Maine, right?
Yes,
Maine, USA. I wouldn't summarize what you said, but you said, number one, economic development is the top priority for North Korea now. And the market, we call 장마당, accounts for about 1/3 of North Korean economy. And you said there are many things we can do or MFIs can do before sanctions are lifted. Thank you for your broad overview of the situation and the issues. Now let me turn to Dr. Lee. He is a researcher at the Korea Institute of Finance. Please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Jeju Forum for inviting me to this important session, and also the Jeju Peace Institute, and together with the World Economic Forum. It's generous of you to provide this kind of session to discuss important issues, especially at this important period of time. So let me first start with, because the session's topic today is multilateral lending institutions and how to attract private capital to North Korea. I first want to touch upon the role of multilateral lending institutions. Brad just gave us a wonderful presentation and important points of MFIs, and I think it's very important for the MFIs to engage with North Koreans before the sanctions are relieved. So I won't go into detail because Brad already presented us with the main points here. What I want to point out with regards to the MFIs is that probably one of the main roles that the MFIs could play during the process or even before the sanctions are lifted is that they could work as an institution where they can provide a certain amount of certainty or relieving the uncertainty around investment towards North Korea. Because we've seen in the past, because there's been very limited businesses that the North Koreans have engaged with the South, and particularly the top two businesses were obviously Kumgangsan sightseeing projects and the Kaesong industrial complex. And we know that whatever reason those two projects were stopped, whether it was the case of in the case of Kumgangsan there was a civilian that was killed while she was sightseeing. And for the case of Kaesong Industrial Complex, there was certain incidents that led to the stop of the project. So, irrespective of whose responsibility those two projects were, the stopping of the two projects were, I think it's important for Kim Jong-un, especially, to send a strong signal to the international community that he has the willingness and he has the will to provide certainty when private capital is being invested into North Korea. And I think the two cases, the two projects that were stopped in the past, by reviving those two projects and how Kim Jong-un approaches the re-inauguration of the projects, I think sends a strong signal to the international community, because if he guarantees the investments that were made to Kumgangsan and Kaesong Industrial Complex, by solving those two issues in a very consistent and a very professional manner, I think that will give a very good signal and a strong signal to the international community. And it will work as a barometer to potential private investors who are willing to invest into North Korea when eventually the sanctions are lifted. So, rather than just providing verbal promises, I think those two cases will work as a very important signal and a very important message to the rest of the world as to how North Korea is willing to attract private capital into North Korea. So, in addition, I would also like to point out, because if you think from an investor's point of view, you have to really have this confidence that your investment is not going to be compromised, before the actual profits can be retrieved back to whichever country you are investing from. So I think one way, this is just like my personal idea, one way to sort of attract or think of as a financial method is probably we can sort of think of issuing, like say, a virtual currency. So if we think of I know there are very negative views against virtual currencies, or nowadays sometimes it's called like initial coin offerings, or I think more recently the word has been changed to like securitized tokens or whatever they call it. One way, because I think the advantages of those kind of financial vehicles is that they can limit the use of that financial instrument, because you can, whenever you issue a security token, or say a coin, you can actually limit the use of that asset, or financial asset, if you may call that. So if the international community sort of agrees upon which kind of items or which kind of assets those coins or security tokens can actually be exchanged for, they can limit the use of military exchanges, exchanging like military weapons or non-peaceful imports that currently is forbidden by various sanctions. So I think because I think the original intent of issuing virtual currencies or these kind of quasi-money was that the government no longer has the right to monopolize the issuance of money, and so it should also be the rights of the people to issue money. And in the case of North Korea, I think it's a very peaceful purpose, and also a very good purpose because of the fact that when the assets are being able to be financed, they can be used to develop the economy of North Korea. Another issue that I want to touch upon is if we look at one of the reasons for maintaining foreign reserves in a certain country. So I'm trying to talk about using possible sources, financial sources, and foreign reserves would be one of them. In the case of Korea, we have more than, I think it's almost approaching 400 billion US dollars. And one of the purposes that the Korean government has been maintaining foreign reserves is preparing for the risk of geopolitical events. And so if we think of the Korean Peninsula situation being settled, there would be less reason, less purpose for foreign reserves to be maintained. And so once these risks are relieved or even eliminated, I think we can release the parts of the foreign reserves.
2 minutes.
Yeah, and use that for economic development and financing investments towards North Korea. I know this would be like a long-term project, but I think it's a good rationale for the government to invest. And I think probably it's also works as a good incentive for other sovereign wealth funds to provide capital to North Korea. I have a couple of other things that I would like to talk, but I'll just stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can talk about those later, but
Sure.
I have one question. North Korea trying to attract private capital already by establishing industrial parks or special economic zones like Najin Sambong. And I know some Chinese money went into North Korea, right? So maybe later in your intervention, you can spend a little time on what is actually happening now in terms of foreign private capital in North Korea. Okay? Next, I'd like to ask Jeffrey C., Joseon Exchange.
First off, I think thanks a lot to the Jeju Peace Institute and the World Economic Forum for organizing this panel. And I say it mainly because, working in the North Korea space, I think it tends to be a very insular field. And it's always great to have people with expertise in other areas and applying the expertise to the problems that we see in the country. So I think it's great that you've put together this panel where we have so much expertise from outside. So what I want to do in my kind of short introduction is, first off, to introduce what are we doing in North Korea and what are we doing today. So this is happening as we speak, and I hope to kind of end off with 4 ideas that I hope would be quite controversial in the context of what's being discussed about North Korea. So just a very quick introduction. So I come from an organization called Jeju Exchange. We are a non-profit based in Singapore and Vietnam. So we're very glad to have hosted the last 2 meetings between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un. And we organize programs in North Korea to help them learn about economic policy, entrepreneurship, and business. So we've been doing this for the last 11 years. We have trained 2,600 North Koreans, and we've brought 100 over of them to various places like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Switzerland for training programs. So this is a picture from one of the workshops that we did in North Korea. So this is being held in the Grand People's Study House, which is kind of like the national library in the country. So this is another program held in one of the economic zones that was talked about, somewhere about 50 kilometers north of Pyongyang in Eunjong Park. This is a workshop that we, from a Women in Business program. So we have one program specifically focused on female entrepreneurs in North Korea. Because of a quirk of the system, we see a lot of females engaging in entrepreneurship since the 90s, and a lot of them have actually built pretty formidable and relatively autonomous businesses in the country. So we get the North Koreans to we work with enterprises all the way from state-owned enterprises, economic policy makers, to people who are just building their first idea. So this is a pitch session at the end of one of their programs where a North Korean scientist was talking about some of the research he was doing and how he would translate it into a potential commercial opportunity within his country. And I think in a country, in a context like North Korea, where the economy is transitioning, I think it's particularly important to focus on newer businesses and helping them understand how business is done in other countries and being able to actually implement those ideas in the context of North Korea today, mainly because they're starting from scratch. So I think just in terms of how we approach the issue in North Korea, the end game for us is still policy reform and the building of institutions that will allow North Korea to develop its economy and integrate with the rest of the world. But the way we do it is both top-down by training the policymakers, the researchers, the state-owned enterprise managers. But what we also encourage them to do is to kind of focus on the micro level, right? So we get the North Koreans to build businesses, to try out ideas, to experiment on a small scale, and that feeds back into the policy process because they actually get to see what's happening, they get to see what the roadblocks are, and they're able to kind of think about frameworks or policies that then would address some of this issue. Because without actually trying any of these ideas, there's very little context for them to understand what policy changes they actually have to make. So I'm just going to run through very quickly one of the programs that we did. So in Eunjong Park, so this is an economic zone that sits around 50 kilometers north of Pyongyang City. We had a group of scientists who were very interested in learning how they could actually enter the commercial space and take research out of the lab and turn it into real businesses. So we brought this the Economic Zone Committee down to Singapore back in 2015. We introduced them to so this is a picture of the zone. So as you can see, it's like there's a lot of infrastructure being built around the zone. So that's where the scientists live. And we brought them to Singapore. We hosted them for 3 months there. They learned about incubators. They learned about scientific economic zones. And what they did when they went back to North Korea was that they actually took those ideas and created their own incubator. So they run 6-month programs in the country. And at the end of the 6 months, we bring a group of workshop leaders down to North Korea, to Eunjong Park, and we actually mentor these startups that they have been preparing for the last 6 months to give them feedback on their ideas. So since 2016, in the last 2 batches, we had 27 startups come out of this process. And what has been most exciting for us, this is some of the ideas that they've been creating, is that it feeds back into the policy process because they start seeing all the problems when you don't have a system that protects property rights, that allow entrepreneurs to share in the profits of their endeavors, and they're actually doing changes to the economic framework within the economic zone in response to what they have seen from this experiment that they're doing in the park. So I think that's been very, very exciting for us. So I think that's just a very brief introduction of what we do. The programs are still ongoing. We just did a workshop in Pyongyang in April. We did an overseas program in May, and then we have 3 other programs coming up later this year. The point I want to kind of leave with the audience, and I hope it's controversial, is that very often we see a lot of ideas come out from research papers around what North Korea should be doing on the economy, how people would collaborate with them. But I think one thing that is very, very lacking is that there is very little input from the North Korean side in a lot of these ideas. I think any research idea, any proposal does require some insight into how North Koreans think about these topics, what they actually understand about these issues, and whether they see the problem with the same perspective that we do. So I think that is very critical. The second part is is linked to that initial point, right? In order to get that feedback, we need consistent dialogue with the North Koreans, and we need to invest in building those channels and platforms for the longer term. So programs like what's happening here, platforms like the World Economic Forum, I think are great places where this kind of dialogue hopefully can happen with the North Koreans attending and getting feedback and also engaging in real discussions with the international community so that we understand how they think, and we are also be able to shape how they think about their interactions with the rest of the world. The third point I want to make is that it's very important to focus not just on what could be done, but also what we should be doing today. And I think it's very important that we kind of look at practical programs that can begin today within the sanctions of framework and to be investing in those efforts. And the last point I want to make is that I think, having been working on this issue for the last 14 years, we have seen many generations of policymakers come and go, and there's very little consistency from one generation of policymakers to the next. And I think it's very important to invest in this problem as a long-term issue and having more of an intergenerational dialogue that allows us, allows the next generation to share in the same values, same aspirations, and same ideas, and be able to carry them on, as the politics shift and as the issue kind of continues to drag out. So I'm kind of very glad today actually to see a lot of young students here. I don't know whether you're gang pressed by a university to attend this session, but it's great that we are able to reach audiences like you, and hopefully you'll carry some of these ideas on as you go into your different careers on how we can work on this issue in North Korea.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Amazing story. He is not Korean, he's a Singaporean, and it's really, I respect and pay my tribute to you because you have been working on this project last 12 years, trained 2,600, 2,600 North Koreans and brought 100 people to Southeast Asia. So it's a really, human resources ultimately going to decide whether North Korea will become better economy, better society. Let me ask you, of course, number one, how do you finance your NGO? Number two, in your encounter with the North Korean people and institutions, how would you evaluate the technology level, their level of technology or knowledge? Okay, later on, could you answer? Okay, let's go around one round. Maybe you have some additional comments to make, but also I'd like to ask one general question that, Brad, you mentioned Kim Jong-un takes economic development as the equally important goal for their country. But I'm not sure Kim Jong-un has decided his mind, or North Korean leadership decide their mind about what kind of economic system they envision. It's the mixed economy you mentioned, but it's just by accident. I mean, the North Korean markets developed by accident, not by any design, right? So I'm sure North Korean authorities find it kind of embarrassing or kind of perplexed by this growth of the 장마당, the market economy. So do you have any idea what Kim Jong-un really wants, or North Korean system really wants in terms of economic system, and whether foreign capital can play a role, so forth? So this is a broad question, but probably we can start with that.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, from the very beginning, even in his first speech, Kim Jong-un has committed himself to an economic development that would benefit the lives of ordinary North Koreans. That's kind of a new public commitment in North Korea, and really distinguishes him from certainly his father. And throughout, he has started early emphasizing giving the cabinet more responsibility for economic strategy and implementation, and reducing the role of the party in the economic management and policy making. And that started in 2013, and it was really consolidated in the Six-Party Congress of 2016, when they elevated Park Pan-ju, for example, to be a vice chairman of the new State Administration Council, elevating his role in this larger management of the country, and giving the cabinet a very different level of authority than it was in the previous regime, when the military first party running a lot of things and the cabinet being third really down the ladder. That's changed. And he's looking for more technocratic support in making this economic development policy real. The Bunjin policy of giving equal value to the nuclear and missile program and economic development were really first articulated in 2013, and then it was really adopted as state policy and strategy in the 2016 Seventh Party Congress. So, and he made a very long speech about economic things in that, and he never mentioned the word markets once. So there is a deep dilemma inside the system about how to put the economy in a more policy-driven, managed way, rather than reacting to events on the ground, which is how the market economy has evolved, is reactive to what was going on the ground, having to accommodate the growing role of markets. How to shift that to a proactive managing economic development, and what's the role of the market in that strategy. I think that there is a deep dilemma within the system between that part of the system which is still embedded in the economic thinking that both was underpinning the old, now failed state planning system, but also some very deep traditional Korean values that were articulated under Kim Il-sung's Juche policy of putting the collective interest of the state ahead of private interests of individuals, and of the reciprocal obligations of the leader and the people. And those two things are really come out of not out of communism, they come out of Korean history. And the North Korean economic system was a hybrid of the Soviet and the traditional Korean values. And that's still an obstacle, because the idea of endorsing private returns to private initiative, that are not embedded in the obligations to the state is a very radical shift from the system that was really set in place by Kim Il-sung. And when I talk about the need for Kim Jong-un to help transform the relationship of the state to the people, a really critical issue is accepting the idea that returns to private initiative are politically acceptable in a system that really did not ever acknowledge that that was a legitimate thing. But the reality is that's the way most people are succeeding now. And you have a system, a society where a fairly large percentage of people are making their way because of their effort and participation in the market, and returns to their efforts are much higher than someone who's employed by the state in the state security apparatus or in the military. And the fact that the wage differences between those two parts of society are so great is a real internal challenge and tension. And one of the ways that it's being addressed or handled internally is through corruption. Corruption is the way that the state is extracting rents from the successes in the market economy and allowing that part of the system which is not plugged into the market economy to somehow get some benefit out of it. Loyalty payments have taken the place of normal taxation of market activity. So the policies and the institutions of managing a mixed economy have not evolved in any kind of rational way that we would expect from the outside. And I think this is a fundamental challenge, a political and policy challenge for Kim Jong-un. He's not been willing to say publicly, I want, like Vietnam, to transition to a market economy. And that is a restraint.
He wants or doesn't want?
He wants economic development, but he's tolerated an enormously rapid growth of the role of private activity, including the emergence of very successful dongju, who are private entrepreneurs, a growing middle class, a political economy where private returns to initiative are growing, that the boundary between the state and the market economy is getting very blurry at this stage, and where entrepreneurs are acting not just as managers of productive activity, they're now taking on a financial role of mediating private savings with private investment in working capital and investing in new enterprises, substituting for a financial system that does not function to mediate domestic savings and investment in any kind of a meaningful way, but which is necessary to get a market economy growing robustly. So yes, he has a major internal challenge of policy. And the key is, are you willing to say, we want to become a market economy the way both China and Vietnam have done? And the answer is, they haven't been able to find it in themselves yet to be able to make that commitment.
What is he afraid of? Because there are two great success stories, China and Vietnam, right? The Communist Party maintains the political power, but market economy is functioning. So it's a great examples which have been proven. So he can go that direction, that the Communist Party maintains the power and open the market economy, but he's still reluctant, right?
Well, yes and no. I think he has made significant changes in the political configuration of the country in putting the party back in charge, rejuvenating the institutions of the party and the Politburo and the role of the Supreme National Assembly, realigning the role of the party in the military and the cabinet, and putting it on a basis that looks a lot more like it works in China or in Vietnam than it did when he inherited the system from his father. If I were a Chinese, I would say this is going in the right direction, that maybe North Korea could become the third jewel of the crown of successful socialism, where you can have a communist party running a market economy that produces economic growth and sustains a traditional communist system. And he's a lot closer to that now than he was in 2011 or 12 when he got started. And they're going in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you. Yoon Suk, I asked one question, but another question is, current Korean government, Moon Jae-in government, trying to do more economic exchanges. And number one, I think one of the priority is to reopen the Kaesong And also, Moon Jae-in government is very eager to connect rails, right? Invest or help North Korea to build better, improve the rail system. So what can current Korean government do with the sanctions imposed in terms of these areas, the improved economic relations between South and North? Could you respond?
I mean, to be frank with you, I think there's very little that the Korean government can do because, everything is sanctioned by the UN security sanctions and also U.S. financial sanctions. So, I mean, if President Trump decides to exempt some of the transactions that the South Korean government is willing to cooperate with the North, I think that would be a good thing. But that's a totally different decision that has to be made by the U.S. government. So, if I may, going back to your question, I think at this point, Brad and also Jeffrey made a very good point about how we can approach things at this current period. Because if we can't provide any financial assistance to North Korea, I think the only sort of practical way to approach and try to solve this situation is if the sanctions are lifted or some of the sanctions are exempted, how can we prepare for that kind of situation? Because we know that, I'm sure Jeffrey has more to elaborate on that. North Koreans are willing to develop their economy, not just Kim Jong-un himself, but I think it's the everyday citizens of North Korea who has the willingness to prosper. And I think throughout the years, they have built this confidence that they are able to become a prosperous nation. Because one of the things that I've been hearing from people who have visited North Korea or who are interacting with North Koreans is that North Koreans have this confidence that because of the fact that they were able to achieve a certain amount of economic growth, even under the sanctions that have been implemented for several years now, I think they have this confidence that if once the sanctions are relieved or lifted, they can actually grow at a tremendous amount of pace. And people are starting to come up with these figures, and some of the figures are pointing to two-digit growth at least, say 10-15% per year once the sanctions are relieved and North Korea decides to open to the rest of the world. So with that kind of sentiment in mind, I think North Koreans are very confident that once the sanctions are relieved, they're able to achieve a certain significant amount of economic growth. So in order for that to happen, North Koreans are also willing, and they are trying to be prepared to achieve this economic prosperity. And one of the things is that they have to engage with the rest of the world in how to, liberalize their financial markets, how to operate foreign exchange systems, how to, normalize banking systems, how to attract capital from the rest of the world, and so forth. So I think it's in the very interest of the North Koreans to engage and to interact with, especially economic side, of course, South Koreans, but also, like we've seen in the case of Jeffrey doing with through Chosun Exchange, they have obviously a very high intention to engage with the rest of the world in coming up with development of their own country.
Could you mention North Korea already welcomes foreign investment, foreign direct investment? Are there some actual cases of foreign investment?
Well,
No?
I mean, I don't really have the detailed information, but from what I've been hearing, I'm sure Jeffrey can elaborate more on that. The Chinese have invested huge investments into like natural resource areas, mining and coal,
maybe
and all that.
tourism.
Right. Okay. And, obviously, a good example is the Egyptian telecommunications company, Orascom, that has installed telecommunication systems. But, the example of Orascom gives you a nice sort of, history of the North Koreans dealing with foreign investment companies is that, whenever foreigners try to retrieve profits from North Korea, eventually the North Koreans are not willing to give back the proper profits or investments that they originally promised. So that's another example of how North Korea should actually deal with that problem. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Jeffrey?
Actually, I want to pick up on a point that Yun Sok talked about, which is this Orascom and the experience of foreign investors in North Korea. I think the education piece ties in very well with this because there's a huge cultural gap between how the North Koreans understand investment and doing business with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world thinks about this. So, about 2 years ago, I met a North Korean who was building a digital payment platform in North Korea. It was a very interesting idea, and she was going out to China and trying to get people interested in the concept. So I asked her, what are you presenting to them? And she said, they would come into the business, they would invest, they would transfer the technology, and in 5 years' time, we would kind of take over the project. So she's thinking of it like a build, operate, transfer model. And I told her, you're asking a foreign investor to come in, aside from all the sanctions risks, to take on the risk of building your business, putting the capital, and then 5 years down the road, when you achieve traction and maybe have profitability, you would take it back. Is that right? And she thought about it, and she kind of was like, oh yeah, actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think so some of this, they just don't understand it, and the system is not set up to cope with that kind of investment. And then you think about the conversation you need to have with these people, and they're reasonable. You explain to them, they understand it, and they say, maybe we can try different things. But then you have to repeat that conversation with all the other stakeholders that have to be bought into the decision, because the institutions are not set up to deal with this influx. So I think that's just one of the challenge of working with North Korea and trying to bridge that gap between how they understand the role of investors in the system and how the rest of the world kind of sees it.
My questions, I asked about the source of funds for your NGO and also technology level in North Korea.
Cool. So I'll start with the second question first and go back to the first one. So technology in North Korea, it's a very interesting angle because they exhibit areas where there is some degree of excellence, which is surprising, and then other areas where definitely is kind of very far behind. I think overall, the Koreans are very interested in technology. They believe that a knowledge-based economy is the path forward. Their chairman, Kim Jong-un, has made a lot of statements to the extent about building a knowledge-based economy, and they know that it's important. And they have kind of reflected that in their policies in terms of giving a fair bit of privilege and attention to scientists that in the past did not really exist for them. On the other hand, I think scientific exchange, scientific knowledge cannot grow without interaction and integration into the rest of the world because the pace of change is so quick. I work in the technology space, in the tech space, and venture capital space now, outside of Chosun Exchange, and you can't build great tech ideas, tech business without interaction with an entire ecosystem. And they are missing that ecosystem. They don't really understand it. They believe you can reverse engineer a lot of things just by reading patent documents from overseas, downloading some textbooks, but they are not plugged into that overall flow of knowledge. And I think that is a huge hindrance to the attempt to build this knowledge economy. But that said, they are very interested, and I think that is a very useful angle for interacting with them and bringing them kind of to the international community and having dialogue with them in a way that everyone sees as mutually beneficial. In terms of funding for programs, I think the last 4 years have been challenging, especially since the nuclear test of 2016. I think we are still struggling with it. I don't think there's been any major turnaround. But currently, the programs are funded by individual donors, foundations, and those are the key sources of funding. Sorry?
Your sources are international, not just confined to Singapore, but...
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'd like to open the floor for discussions. 불 좀 더 밝게 해주실래요? Yeah, please. 불 좀 밝게 해주세요. Light.
I'm Spencer Kim with Pacific Century Institute.
Could you have microphone?
And a question to
잠깐만 기다리세요. 마이크로폰 좀 갖고 오세요.
I'm Spencer Kim with Pacific Century Institute. Hello, Dr. Jung. I have a general comment to make and then question to Jeffrey. Both of you alluded to Kim Jong-un's plan, and I differ with you because as early as 1911 September, before the Congress met, they were already described the transition. They all knew Kim Jong-il was dying, so they said they start disclosing the juche and the military first was not of their choice. It's only because they had limited resources that they had to put priorities on military, and that they were now seeking light industries in order to increase the quality of their citizens. So I just want to say that. In other words, the plan that Kim Jong-un is now following was pre-described before Kim Jong-il died. My question to Jeffrey, in your fundraising and also functioning in and out of North Korea, how difficult was it to maintain a transparency? Because if you don't have the transparency, no funder will fund you, especially in the international market. So could you share that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think for us, transparency, I think it's an issue in the sense that a lot of the donors we work with don't want to be exposed. So I'm thinking is it in terms of acknowledging donors publicly. So I think for us, one of the big challenge has been I wouldn't say for all the donors, but a fair set of the donors, they've been very nervous in terms of being exposed publicly because of the kind of fear that as the politics shift, whether they would get there will be sensitivities around supporting programs around North Korea. I think for us, we've been trying for a number of years to also broaden the pool of funding, but generally the traditional sources for nonprofits, for example, corporate funding and so on, have been hard to obtain with regards to North Korea because there's very little benefits to any corporation engaging with North Korea. There's no commercial opportunities that they see on the horizon. There's a lot of sensitivity around doing things in North Korea, and so we kind of respect a lot of donors when they say that they don't want their funding to be acknowledged. On the North Korean side, there's also a lot of challenges. I think the North Koreans can be very sensitive about kind of funding. They are very picky about who gets to support their program, and I think that places a fair bit of restrictions on kind of what we can accept and do too. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Was there any requirement that the funders imposed upon you to report back to them on how you are spending the funds?
Yeah, so we do reporting to different funders. They generally have different approaches for how they want us to what they want us to share with them. There's a bit of negotiation there because there are certain details where we regard as pretty sensitive. So for example, some funders, if they ask for excessive personal information regarding the participants of the program, that is something that has been generated for us. It's a mixed bag because on one hand, we are mindful of sanctions compliance, and we do have to report and make sure that whoever participates in the program is not under sanctions. But on the other hand, we are mindful and kind of concerned that whether some of the donors might be using the information in ways that could be problematic for the North Koreans without their active consent of the use of their information. So we kind of have to manage the tensions fairly carefully. In terms of reporting to donors, it varies a lot in terms of what the kind of conditions they impose on us. Some of them, I think, have very clear guidelines of how they want reporting to be done, and that's generally very helpful for us because very often we also don't really know how the donors expect reporting to be done, especially if they have not had done a program in North Korea before. I think the other thing that comes with donor reporting too is that very often it's not clear to us what the objectives are, and for us it's very hard to kind of report to them the kind of information that we think is useful for them to understand and evaluate programs, just because we don't always understand whether they themselves have a very clear objective to some of the programs that we do.
Okay, we have the expert on sanctions, Mr. Bierstecker, Thomas Bierstecker, here, right? He is a professor at the Geneva Institute of International Development. Would you like to make some comment?
No, thank you very much, but I'm afraid I missed most of the presentation, so I don't have a comment at this point. But I would be interested in speaking with people who have the actual experience in trying to conduct this kind of work within the DPRK. But thanks very much for the presentation.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to make one comment about sanctions because apart from all the negative effects of sanctions, which get a lot of attention and different ways that North Korea gets around them, one of the implications of sanctions or impacts is it's changing the incentive environment for both state and non-state actors within the country to find ways to mobilize and to use domestic resources more efficiently. And some of the economic growth that we've seen in the last few years is an unintended impact of sanctions in helping the North Koreans improve the efficiency of their domestic economy, which is very distorted, and there's lots of room for economic growth from domestic productivity improvements, which the markets are contributing to, which are being forced into this because of sanctions. So if you didn't have sanctions, you'd be saying, well, they're beginning to do some things right to begin to get a domestic economy working more efficiently and getting more productivity and growth out of domestic effort rather than relying on foreign savings to get out of meet their economic needs. So it's a double-edged sword, is what I'm saying. Sanctions have negative effects, but they also have some unintended effects that are helping North Korea become a more efficient domestic economy.
That's hard to follow, but anyway. Yes.
I just wanted to comment about. Today's topic is about attracting private capital and the role of multilateral institutions. But I believe it's a similar sort of sentiment among us. There's very little that we can do, and so given the fact that, Jeffrey here, by operating Chosun Exchange, I think he's done a very tremendous job of trying to educate and interact with North Koreans. One of the things that I want to point out is by looking at the activities of Chosun Exchange, I think as a South Korean, I feel both sad and sometimes, at a certain extent, embarrassing, because probably it should be the job of South Koreans that should be doing what Chosun Exchange has been done over the past decade or so. Not just because the South Koreans are well equipped or they are in a better position, but also from a humanitarian point of view. We have South Koreans have even still relatives living in North Korea. We are neighboring countries, and we used to be a single country before the peninsula was divided. So apart from the economic incentives for doing these kind of interactions with the North Koreans, I think the South Koreans should be doing a much more better job of engaging these kind of activities. And one main obstacle, or should I say a wall, for doing these kind of activities is the current laws that are governing South Korea.
South Korean law.
Exactly. And I presume it's also a similar environment in North Korea. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's time for South Koreans to actually seriously be discussing about changing the laws that are preventing these kind of interactions with the North Koreans, because as you all know, in South Korea there's a National Security Act that prevents South Koreans from directly engaging with the North Koreans. So you have to submit reports, or you even have to get pre-approvals from the government. So I think it's time for the society to actually open this discussion, and we need this kind of discussion in order to prepare for these upcoming events.
I'm sure there are many South Korean individuals and institutions who are willing to help North Korea, especially in human resource development area. And for example, 조선일보, they have pretty big fund to do this. And I don't know the details, but so I think it's beginning. Okay, questions? Yes, two of you.
Sorry, hello, I'm Sina from the UN Human Rights Office operating in Seoul. And my question is in relation to two groups who are more or less the backbone of the North Korean economy as we talk now. First of all, women. And my question is, what can private investors, and I know some of some of your programs for women entrepreneurs, but also MFIs, do to ensure that those women working now on the market are not left further behind as we go in with bigger projects. The second group I wanted to address is those people who are working under what we would more or less consider forced labor conditions, especially when it comes to bigger infrastructure projects such as railroads and electricity and so forth. What are some of the practices, and are there lessons that can be learned from elsewhere on how to address these groups and how to move forward without entrenching a system that's not particularly pleasant for most of those people? Because I very much agree that we need private investment and MFIs to be part of this process, and the economy needs to improve. But how to do it, and what are some of the lessons we can draw from elsewhere?
Forced labor in North Korea.
Forced labor and women.
And women. Later. Let's have second question, please.
My name is Kathy Zellweger. I have been involved with North Korea since 1995, have trained probably the first economists outside of the country in 1998 when nobody spoke about the economy. So I'm, of course, deeply concerned what's happening now, and I do like Bradley's suggestion that we should start now, and we cannot wait until the sanctions are lifted. We may wait for a very long time if that's the case. So my suggestion would be, shouldn't we look into re-establishing UNDP in North Korea? The United Nations Development Program has the mission also to do educational projects. And I think they have been on the ground, they were kicked out, or they had to close down, let me put it that way. They were not kicked out, they had to close down because of outside sources. And I do think they would be one of the channels I could really support to start back working on the issues which Bradley mentioned. That's the suggestion. And then having done economic training too, also right now I work mostly with people with disabilities in North Korea. My question is, outside of North Korea, where could a group of North Korean senior government officials go to learn about the international financial institutions, provided we had funding and we were getting the visas, which is another problem we have nowadays. So I would be grateful for some concrete ideas, because I'm very much a hands-on person. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. You're familiar with what the Canada's UBC, University of British Columbia, doing? Of course, they invite only six professors every year, but still, they become economic officials afterwards. Please.
One is, we talk about these restrictions and limited opportunities to engage North Korea because of sanction. But sanction really started not that long ago. So what did we do prior to the time? This second issue is, yes, we used to bring large number of very senior economic government functionaries to U.S. and in a group, and we trained them in university environment, and we also took them to different locations for different purposes, and they were very successful. They continue to talk about how much they have gained from that experience.
Okay. So Brad, you are going to answer, but before, we are going to have one more round of questions, and I'd like to ask one of Tamna's university students to ask a question, so please be prepared. Okay, Brad?
Okay, start with women. There's no question but that women are the dominant force in the way markets have evolved in North Korea, and over the last 20 years it's really remarkable, and I'm sure Jeffrey would reinforce the fact that a lot of the entrepreneurship is coming from young women who have motivation and will and capacity to really try to find a way to succeed in the markets. And I think that was a message that was also reinforced when the Vietnamese have been talking with North Korea about their experience. And one of the main messages, because I've worked with Vietnamese who were very involved in their own process over the years, one of their main messages was how important women in Vietnam were for the success of the transition. And that's a message they're giving to the North Koreans, that this is a good thing and they should endorse it and support it. On the forced labor, North Korea from the very beginning has tended to over-rely on forced labor to get productivity improvements. They haven't been able to get them through technology transfer or innovation, so they've tended to rely on forced labor with these labor marches and campaigns to up productivity when they were really needed to make a dent. So it's a deeply embedded part of the North Korean economic system, and it's linked to this idea that people are supposed to serve the state, not their own interests. Helping North Korea move off of that is a big challenge, but I think it's a really critical one, because bringing North Korea into a place where they're willing to accept some of the ILO provisions of labor, rules governing labor. There's been progress in terms of labor mobility. There's been progress in terms of different wage rates and different labor conditions in terms of hourly versus monthly, et cetera. There's a lot more flexibility for state managers to manage labor on their own without the party telling them what to do, including using excess profits to reinforce, to give performance bonuses for labor to get more productivity. So there are elements of progressive movement, and there's an economic rationale for it. And I think reinforcing the economic rationale for not going down the forced labor road, but for finding other ways to get motivated productivity improvements in North Korean labor is really a really open field that has a lot of opportunity in North Korea. And the kind of advice they get from their partners in how to relate to labor in the economic development process would be critical to reinforcing those sorts of messages, which will have a positive human rights impact in addition to a positive economic impact. So there's a real opportunity for win-win in that area. On UNDP, Kathy, I couldn't agree more. In my own experience opening up the World Bank relationship in Vietnam, UNDP was on the ground, well established, and extremely helpful to the other multilateral organizations as they navigated their way into a relationship. UNDP had played that role even when I went there in 1998. They were my host to help me feel that I was at home in Pyongyang when I was there. And so rehabilitating a UNDP role, particularly because it doesn't involve money, it involves advice, technical assistance, education, things that will help till the soil to improve the environment for collaboration with other partners. I think it'd be a very good first step, and it could be relatively easily done, and it's not something that could be really all that impacted by sanctions if people feel that this is a direction they want to go. On the question of outside opportunities to learn about the MFIs, I think there have been a number of opportunities outside of North Korea. I participated in Track 2 meetings and other places. It's a little more difficult for Americans these days because of constraints that the U.S. government places on Americans meeting with North Koreans anywhere in the world. It makes Track 2 harder. But there are non-Americans who are already involved in dialogues with North Korea outside. A recent one by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue used a non-American in a recent discussion that they organized. So there are beginning to be some opportunities for that. And the last thing I want to say, just to take a moment, is we don't talk much about the IMF in all of this, because the IMF is not in the development finance business, but they are absolutely critical to the process of getting North Korea in a place where the rest of the world will want to do business with them. And I really feel it was true in Vietnam, it was true in Myanmar, and it's going to be true in North Korea that IMF first. It's getting the IMF to help on the statistics, transparency issue, which is a major constraint, is really going to be critical.
Is it correct? I understand to be a member of IMF, you should have a national income accounting system established. And is it true? And how long does it take to establish? Number one. Number two, I understand North Korea is a member of ESCAP.
Yes.
And if you are a member of ESCAP, I hear it's easier to become a member of ADB, Asia Development Bank. So why can't North Korea become a member of ADB now?
Well, legally...
Hold on. Yeah. You answer later. Jeffrey, you have answer.
I just want to briefly touch on, I think, both the points that Spencer Kim and Kathy Zellweger talked about. I think when we think about the work we do, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And I think both of them have been doing, supporting and doing the kind of work that we've been doing way before I ever stepped foot on the Korean Peninsula. And I think the important lesson I draw from what they're doing and the fact that they're still involved today is that consistency matters a lot. I think there very often, there is a shift in policy, there's a shift in level of tension, and a lot of activities drop off at those points, and you lose a lot of the institutional knowledge and institutional channels for organizing this kind of programs. And we've kind of seen that happen too. And I remember having this conversation with Spencer and getting advice back in 2016 when the situation was getting very tense, and I asked, what should I do? And the lesson I drew from the conversation was that, we kind of have to build our own careers elsewhere and ride out the coming storm at that point in time, with the view that this issue is going to have this ups and downs for the next 20, 30 years, and you have to find a way to kind of like survive through it. And what we did at that point in time was we fired all our staff. And we said we will become a pure volunteer network. We will run projects as and when there is support for it, but the aim is to transition that knowledge more from an individual or a team of individuals into a network. And I think that's kind of what we have done, right? So now we have volunteers. I try not to step into most of the programs unless I have to. When there is opportunities to speak and share the experience working with North Koreans, we pass it on to the team of volunteers. And I think that's kind of what helps us build that consistency. And I think it's important when we think about all these channels, whether it's the UNDP, all the kinds of channels, is that people are thinking about how do you make it, in a sense, recession-proof to the shifts in political tensions and relationships.
Okay, last chance for you to ask questions. Anybody from Tamna University? You can ask in English or Korean or Chinese. No? Okay. Okay, please.
Okay, my name is Kubota from Tama University, Japan, and thank you very much for very impressive presentation and discussion. I was very impressed with the discussion about how to deal with North Korea or how to realize peace. And I would like to ask Professor Babson, because you said to have advice. To give advice is important. So what can we do as a university student for realize the peace of North Korea? This is question.
What can the university student can do to be prepared for the future North Korean business? Okay, hold on. Another question? Hold on. Another question? No? Okay, then we'll give a few minutes each to each speakers, please. Bob.
Well, what can students do? The students can get to know what the reality of North Korea is from an economic point of view, and get to know the opportunities that may emerge in the future to play a role that will be helpful, whether it's as in a knowledge relationship with them, in training and education, whether it's in being part of an NGO that is able to carry out the kinds of programs that Jeffrey has been involved in, and that would be good for North Korea and South Korea to do together, and hopefully to be able to be involved in some business relationships, not just in hiring North Koreans, but in working with them in a joint venture, or in supporting efforts to get backward linkages and help develop the market economy in North Korea. I just want to respond briefly to your question about the IMF. The IMF, to become a member of the IMF, a country does have to be able and willing to publish national income statistics and balance of payment statistics. And at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a large number of former countries that were part of the Soviet system joined the IMF in a very short period of time. And there was a massive effort to work with those countries to help train them and to get their statistical systems up to a point where they could meet minimum requirements of the IMF in terms of statistical reporting. And it's an ongoing process of improvement in all countries to improve the quality of those statistics. But they're absolutely incredibly important for private investors investors and for governments to know transparently what the economic and financial condition of the country is. North Korea does not publish those data, and it was a really major constraint on future private and official investment with North Korea. The second thing on membership, you're right. To become a member of the World Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's required to be a member of the IMF before you become a member of the World Bank or AIIB. ADB is different, and you're right. If a country is a member of SCAP, that's the precondition for being eligible to become a member of ADB. The only reason that rule exists is because the Pacific Islands, who were members of SCAP, wanted to be able to receive economic development assistance, but they're not members of the IMF. And so it was a political decision to create that rule to enable the Pacific Islands to be able to get access to development finance through the ADB. In April 1997, North Korea sent a letter to the ADB asking for membership, and they were flatly rejected. Of course, at the time, ADB was the dominant country in ADB is Japan, and the U.S. is number 2. And when I was there about 7 or 8 months later, the North Koreans came up to me and they said, well, you've been frank with us, can we be frank with you? I said, sure. They said, did we make a mistake writing a letter to ADB? And I said, yes, you made 2 mistakes. One is you didn't know the answer before you wrote the letter. And the other was no one ever heard of a commissioner signing a letter to a financial institution. There should have been a minister of finance or a head of a chairman of a state bank or something that had authority. But the person who signed the letter, in those days, they had commissions. The ministries weren't very important. It wasn't until '98 that they restructured the government and created real ministries. So they had a disappointing first effort. And then they reached out to the IMF and accepted an IMF mission in September of '97. And in that discussion, and there was a report of the IMF to their board. It was not public, but it was produced a document. It was discussed at the IMF board. And the bottom line of that initial conversation between North Korea and the IMF was, we'd really like the money. We'd really like the training and advice. We don't really want to open the books, and we're very concerned about conditionality on any money. And so we're not ready to go down the road of joining the IMF. And this was in '97, and they did produce a report, and the North Koreans gave them what data they had. They had some stuff on the budget and things. So it's really a question of, and that was a period, and that's when they opened up to the World Bank, and I made my visit. I made a talk about the World Bank. If you remember that period of 98 and 99 was when North Korea opened up to the world. They normalized relations with virtually every country in Europe except France, and with Australia and with Canada, and they were reaching out. They even sent someone to the World Economic Forum back in that era. I remember that. So they were reaching out to the world, and then the world wouldn't really embrace them because of what was going on in the nuclear world, and they lost heart. And they decided this wasn't going to be productive for them, and they withdrew. And it's been a long time since there's been an opening to reopen a serious relationship discussion with them.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. Jeffrey?
I think to the question, I think it's a good one. And my main idea is that I think it's important to think about this problem as a very long-term issue and to plan for it really as if it's like a 30 or 50-year issue, right? When I got involved back in 2005, I assumed this problem, in a sense, would be solved in the next 10 years. And clearly, I'm very, very far off in my estimation. And I think when we think about this, when we think of it as a long-term issue, we should think of it from an intergenerational perspective. So what we have tried to do now is to bring North Koreans to an intergenerational dialogue in Switzerland. And we found that to be effective because we want the fact that there are bridges being built, not just at the senior level or at the middle level, but across different generations, with the idea that they will carry on the principles of this kind of cooperation in the longer term. The second point, I think, is that as a young person, they they can bring new, fresh ideas. I remember Yoon Sok talked about this idea of like, can we use virtual currencies? And I think those are very fresh ideas that are very lacking in the field. And I think we need more of that to enter the space. And I think that's a very, very positive contribution that people who come from outside the sector, come from a different generation, can contribute to this problem.
Thank you. Yusa?
Speaking of ideas, I just wanted to conclude my comments. If President Trump is looking for a location for the third U.S. DPRK summit, I think Jeju is the place. It's sitting right in the middle of the neighboring big four countries. It's an island, so less security concerns. It has been hosting the Forum for Peace and Prosperity for the past decade, I don't know how long. So if you're looking for a place, Jeju is the place.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the session, or you found the session useful, informative. I'm not trying to summarize what we discussed, but some keywords. Number one, there are a lot of things we can do before the sanctions are lifted. And key is human resource, I think. And here, entrepreneurship. That's another keyword. And also, I'm intrigued by this idea of knowledge-based economy, the North Korean leaders trying to achieve knowledge-based economy. That's a surprise. They are very advanced, at least in terms of thinking, right? And they need, the network, the ecosystem, right? And that's what they lack. Okay, would you give a big applause to our speakers? And I'd like to conclude this session. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.